Picture this, a remote stretch of wilderness in the San Boys Mountains of southeastern Oklahoma. Red dirt roads that disappear into the trees, hills that swallow sound, a landscape so isolated that you could vanish there and the world might not notice for days, maybe weeks, maybe longer. Now picture a family, a father, a mother, a 6-year-old little girl driving into those hills one October afternoon. Their truck is found days later, parked on the side of a mountain road. The engine is off. The doors are unlocked. Inside, their wallets, their cell phones, their GPS, their dog still alive, nearly starved, $45,000 in cash sitting in plain sight, and not a single human being anywhere near it. Bobby Jamison, Sherilynn Jamison, their daughter Madyson, gone, completely and utterly gone. Into the hills, into the silence, into one of the most baffling, haunting, and deeply unsettling disappearances in American history. And what investigators would uncover in the weeks and months and years that followed would not bring clarity. It would only deepen the darkness, because the Jamisons were not simply a family who got lost in the woods. They were a family who had been, by all accounts, unraveling, hearing things, seeing things, fearing things that others around them could not see. And when you trace the full story, every detail, every piece of evidence, every whispered account from people who knew them, you begin to wonder whether what took the Jamisons was something of this world at all. Let's go back to the beginning. Bobby Dale Jamison grew up in southeastern Oklahoma, a part of the country that carries its own particular weight. This is the land of the Choctaw Nation, of old timber country, of small towns that sit hours from anywhere significant. It is beautiful country in the way that wild, untamed places are beautiful, which is to say, beautiful and indifferent. Bobby was a large man, heavy-set, quiet in the way that some men are quiet when they're carrying something heavy inside. He worked. He loved his family. He struggled financially, as many people in that part of Oklahoma did. He had a temper, according to some who knew him, but he also had a profound softness when it came to his daughter Madyson, a little girl with blonde hair and a wide smile who was, by every account, the center of both her parents' world. Sherilynn was Bobby's wife, and she was, in the words of people who knew her, a complicated woman, warm and loving in some moments, erratic and frightened in others. She had a documented history of mental health struggles. She had been prescribed a significant number of medications, including antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs. She was deeply, deeply religious, and her faith had taken a shape in the years before the disappearance that had begun to alarm the people around her. But we'll get to that. First, let's establish the world the Jamisons lived in. By the fall of 2009, Bobby and Sherilynn were living in Eufaula, Oklahoma, a small city on the shores of Lake Eufaula. They had Madyson. They had a dog, a blue heeler named Jella. They were struggling financially and had been for some time. Bobby worked in construction and various other jobs, but money was always tight. There were disputes with neighbors. There were disputes with family members. There was a particular and deeply strange dispute with Bobby's father, Bob Sr. That will become important later. But the thing you need to understand, the single most important piece of context for everything that follows, is this. The Jamisons, in the period leading up to their disappearance, believed they were being haunted. Not metaphorically. Not in the vague, general sense that people sometimes use that word. They believed with full and serious conviction that their home, the house in Eufaula, was occupied by a demonic presence. That something was in the walls, that something was watching them, that something was speaking to them or at them or through them. And they were not keeping this belief private. They were telling people, they were seeking help. And the evidence they left behind, physical, documented evidence, suggests that whatever was happening inside that house and inside those minds, it was consuming them entirely. A pastor who worked with the family in the months before they vanished later told investigators and journalists about the conversations he had with Bobby and Sherilynn. He said they came to him repeatedly, increasingly desperate, talking about the presence in their home. They described voices. They described a feeling of being watched, of being followed, of something dark that had attached itself to their family. The pastor took these concerns seriously enough to attempt a kind of spiritual intervention, what some would call a deliverance ministry, others would call an exorcism. He prayed over the house. He prayed over the family, and still the Jamisons said it didn't stop. The voices didn't stop. The feeling didn't stop. At one point, Sherilynn told someone close to her that she believed a 300-year-old witch had put a curse on the family, and that the witch was responsible for the presence in the house. This is the kind of statement that, depending on who you are, you might dismiss. You might chalk it up to mental illness, to delusion, to the particular strain of folk superstition that runs deep in rural Oklahoma. But here's what you cannot dismiss. The physical evidence of what was happening in that house was real. The fear was real. And the behavior it produced was real, behavior that would only make sense in retrospect as the behavior of people who genuinely believed they were in danger from something they could not fight. Now let's talk about Bob Jamison SR, because Bobby's father is a figure who looms over this case in ways that have never been fully resolved. By the time of the disappearance, Bobby and his father were in an active and serious feud. It had escalated far beyond the typical family argument. Bobby had filed a restraining order against his father. His father, according to some accounts, had made threats. There were allegations, and these were not idle gossip. These were allegations Bobby himself made that his father had put a hit out on him, that someone had been hired to kill him. Bobby told this to people in his life. He was, depending on your perspective, either a man with legitimate fears about his physical safety or a man whose paranoia had grown to encompass both the supernatural and the human. Perhaps, and this is what makes the Jamison case so complicated, perhaps it was both. Because fear, real fear, especially the kind born in a mind that is already under enormous pressure, does not always stay tidy. It spreads, it mingles, it becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding darkness. October 8, 2009. This is the last confirmed day that Bobby, Sherilynn, and Madyson Jamison were seen alive. A neighbor reported seeing the family loading boxes into their pickup truck, a red 1998 Chevrolet. This is not unusual on its face, but what was unusual, what the neighbor noted, was the behavior of the two adults. They were moving slowly, deliberately, almost robotically. They did not speak to each other. They did not appear to communicate at all. They simply loaded box after box after box into the truck with the mechanical focus of people operating in some kind of trance. There was no urgency, there was no conversation, there was only silence and labor. The neighbor watched for a while and then went inside unsettled without quite knowing why. That is the last known sighting. Bobby, Sherilynn, and little Madyson drove away, and that was it. They did not come back. Days passed. Nobody heard from them. Their landlord, growing concerned, eventually reported them missing on October 16, 2009, 8 days after that last sighting. Law enforcement began looking. It did not take long to find the truck. It was discovered on a remote mountain road in Latimer County, Oklahoma, in the San Boys Mountains, up a dirt track that most people would not think to drive without a specific destination in mind. The truck was parked, the engine was off, and what investigators found inside it stopped them in their tracks. The wallets were there, the cell phones were there. The GPS device was there, and when investigators downloaded its data, they found that whoever had been using it had been navigating to various plots of land in that area, apparently looking for a specific piece of property. The $45,000 in cash was stacked inside the truck, not hidden, just there. Angela the dog was there, alive but severely dehydrated and malnourished, clearly having been in that truck for several days. You understand what that means. The dog had been alone in that truck for days, which means the Jamisons had left their vehicle, left their dog, left their money, left their phones, left every identifying document they carried, and walked into the wilderness. Why? Where? The mountains around them were searchers' territory now, and the searches began immediately. The terrain is brutal up there. The San Boys Mountains are not gentle hills. They are dense, uneven, heavily forested country. Ravines open up without warning. The elevation changes sharply. Search and rescue teams went in. Helicopters swept the area. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Nothing was found. No bodies, no clothing, no evidence that the Jamisons had ever set foot in that forest beyond the abandoned truck. Weeks passed. The search wound down. The Jamison family became a mystery, a painful, baffling, haunting mystery that their extended family and the people of Oklahoma would carry forward in the years that followed, never quite letting go, never quite accepting that there were no answers. And then investigators started looking more carefully at the footage, because the Jamisons had a security camera at their home in Eufaula, and in the days before their disappearance, that camera had captured something. The footage is what people in this case refer to when they talk about how deeply wrong everything had already gone before that final drive into the mountains. In the recordings from their home security system, you can see Bobby and Sherilynn moving around their property. And their movement is the same thing that the neighbor described on the day they left: slow, deliberate, disconnected. At one point in the footage, Sherilynn is seen walking back and forth along the outside of the house in a repetitive pattern that has no obvious purpose. She's not going anywhere. She's not doing anything. She's simply walking the same path over and over again. Bobby is seen at other moments in a similar state, moving slowly, starring, seemingly not fully present. The footage does not look like the footage of two people preparing for a camping trip or a property scouting expedition. It looks like the footage of two people who are somewhere else, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It looks like the footage of two people who have already gone somewhere that cameras cannot follow. Law enforcement noted that it appeared the adults were possibly under the influence of some substance. Toxicology, of course, could not be run on the living. And the Jamisons' medications, all of Sherilynn's prescriptions, a significant cocktail, were left behind in the house. She had not taken them with her. Now here is where the case takes on its most layered and troubling dimension. Because when investigators went through the belongings left in the house and in the truck, they found documents, papers, and among those papers was a letter written by Sherilynn that described in stark and frightening terms the demonic battle she believed her family was in the middle of. She wrote about the presence. She wrote about the evil that had come into their home. She wrote about her belief that forces beyond the human world were working against her family. And separately in Bobby's papers there were references to the same fears, the haunting, the presence, the sense that something was closing in. There was also documentation of the feud with his father, the alleged threats, the fear of very human violence on top of the supernatural kind. And the $45,000, that money, that strange and specific amount sitting in the truck, investigators never fully established where it came from. Some speculated it was connected to a land deal the Jamisons were pursuing. The GPS data suggested they had been looking at a specific piece of property in the mountains, possibly intending to buy land and perhaps build something there, a new place somewhere removed, somewhere they could start over away from whatever was pursuing them. If that was the plan, it ended in the wilderness, and for 4 years the case had no physical resolution at all. November 2013, 4 years after the disappearance, hunters in the San Boys Mountains came across something in the dense underbrush. They found human remains, 3 sets, partial skeletal remains scattered, exposed to years of weather and wildlife activity. They found clothing, and they were discovered less than 3 miles from where the Jamisons' truck had been parked in 2009. The remains were identified through DNA analysis as Bobby Jamison, Sherilynn Jamison, and their daughter Madyson, a little 6-year-old girl gone 4 years, found in pieces in the Oklahoma wilderness. The world stopped for a moment when that news broke, because finding the remains should have meant something. It should have answered something. It answered almost nothing. The medical examiner's findings were, in the bluntest possible terms, inconclusive. The remains were too degraded, too exposed, too damaged by years in the elements to determine cause of death with any certainty. The bones did not show obvious trauma, no bullet wounds, no fractures consistent with violence. But that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when you're dealing with skeletal remains that have been in the Oklahoma woods for 4 years through heat and cold and rain and animals. You cannot rule out foul play from bones in that condition. You cannot rule out exposure. You cannot rule out anything. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death as undetermined. And so the Jamison case, after 4 years of waiting for something definitive, after finding the worst confirmation possible that these 3 people were dead, remained as open and as unresolved as it had always been. Undetermined. That single word, sitting over 3 graves. What happened to the Jamisons? The theories exist on a spectrum that mirrors in some ways the spectrum of human belief and disbelief. On one end there are the rational, material explanations. Some investigators and analysts have suggested that the most likely scenario is some form of exposure, that the family, for reasons related to their mental state, their medications, or their circumstances, wandered into the wilderness and were simply unable to find their way back. October in those mountains can be brutal. The nights get cold. The terrain, as we said, is unforgiving. If Bobby and Sherilynn were in the dissociative, disconnected mental state that the security footage and the eyewitness accounts suggest, they may have walked into those trees without the capacity to navigate back out. Madyson was 6 years old. She could not have survived alone. If this is what happened, if they simply walked away from that truck and into the dark and could not find their way back, then the cause of their deaths was the wilderness, enabled by whatever was happening inside their minds. Then there is the murder theory. It is darker, and it is also plausible in the way that many things are plausible when you have no evidence to rule them out. Bobby Jamison had explicitly told people he feared for his life. He had filed a restraining order against his own father. He had described a threat, a hired threat, against his life. If someone, his father, someone connected to his father, some other party with a motive that investigators have not publicly identified, had followed the family into those mountains, had waited until they were completely isolated, completely off the grid, completely alone on a remote dirt road in Latimer County, Oklahoma, no one would have seen, no one would have heard. The remains condition means we cannot say definitively that violence did not occur. The money, $45,000 left untouched, argues against a robbery motive, but it does not argue against every other motive. Bob Jamison Sr. was investigated in connection with his son's disappearance. He denied involvement. He died in 2016 without ever, as far as the public record shows, being charged with anything related to his son's case. And I want to spend real time here because this is important. This is the part that people who study this case find hardest to explain away. There is the question of what the Jamisons believed was happening to them. Because you can be rational about this. You can explain away Sherilynn's letter about the demonic presence as the product of a mind under enormous stress, possibly struggling with untreated or undertreated mental illness. You can explain away Bobby's fears as the fears of a man in a genuine dispute with a dangerous family member. You can look at the security footage and say those are people who are mentally unwell, possibly over-medicated or under-medicated in a dissociative or psychotic state. You can say all of that, and it might even be true. But the weight of it, the combined weight of everything the Jamisons described, everything they documented, everything they behaved as though they believed, down to the moment they loaded their daughter into that truck and drove into the mountains, that weight sits on you differently when you spend time with this case, because they were not making it up. Whatever they believed completely, and they were afraid, genuinely, profoundly, desperately afraid, of something in their house, of something in their walls, of something that had followed them. Consider the detail of the GPS. When investigators pulled the data, they found that the device had been used to navigate to several different land parcels in the San Bois Mountains area. This strongly suggests that the drive to the mountains was not random. It was not a family that veered off a highway and got lost. They drove there on purpose. They were looking for something specific, a piece of land, almost certainly, land they may have wanted to buy, to build on, to escape to. And this is where the $45,000 starts to make a different kind of sense. If you are a family who believes a demonic presence has infested your home, your current home, the place where your daughter sleeps and wakes up and hears the voices, and if you believe that moving, really moving, to a new and remote place might free you from that presence, you might bring cash. You might bring cash to close a deal on land. You might be planning in your frightened, fractured, desperate way not to disappear but to start over. And something, somewhere between the truck and the tree line, went terribly wrong. The 6-year-old haunts this story, every version of it, every theory, because whatever the adults were experiencing, whatever they believed, whatever choices they made, Madyson made none of them. She was 6, she went where her parents took her. She trusted, as children trust, that the adults around her knew what they were doing, that they would keep her safe. And she went with them into those mountains and did not come back. No version of this story ends in a way that is not heartbreaking. If they got lost and died of exposure, she died cold and frightened in the dark. If someone did them harm, she was in the truck when it was found and she walked away with them regardless. If the psychological state the adults were in contributed to choices that put the family in danger, she was carried along by those choices without understanding them. She was 6. She had a wide smile. She was the light of 2 people's lives. And the San Bois Mountains kept her for 4 years before giving her back, and even then gave back only bones. There are people who have spent years on this case, amateur investigators, true crime researchers, journalists, the family members of the Jamisons themselves, who believe there is still a human perpetrator out there. Someone who drove those mountains, someone who knew that family was isolated, someone who knew about the money, someone who acted. And there are others who look at everything, the security footage, the letters, the pastor's account, the medications, the documented mental state of both adults, and believe this was a tragedy born entirely from the inside. From fear, from illness, from belief. From the particular and terrible confluence of circumstances that can drive people, when they are frightened and unmoored and convinced that something evil is pursuing them, to make choices that lead them beyond the reach of anyone who might have helped. And there are some, a smaller number but not zero, who find the whole story impossible to account for without lingering on the details that don't fit any rational frame. The dog. The dog survived, it stayed with the truck, it waited. Animals are often the detail that most clearly marks the line between what we can explain and what we cannot, because animals do not have the complex, pressured, medicated, terrified minds of human beings. The dog waited, and the family walked away, into the quiet, into the dark. Here is what we know with certainty. Bobby Jamison, Sherilynn Jamison, and Madyson Jamison disappeared from the San Bois Mountains of Oklahoma in October 2009. Their remains were found in November 2013. The cause of their deaths was officially classified as undetermined. No one has ever been charged in connection with their deaths. The Latimer County Sheriff's Office, which has jurisdiction, has stated over the years that the investigation remains open. There are people who believe it will be solved one day. There are people who believe it never will be. The case file exists. The bones were buried. The questions remain. And when you look at photographs of that mountain road, the red dirt track, the dense trees, the particular October light of Oklahoma falling through the leaves, you understand, maybe for the first time, how a family could drive to the end of that road and simply cease to be part of the world. The mountains took them. Whatever brought them there, the mountains kept them. And the voices, whatever they were, wherever they came from, went quiet at last. But not entirely quiet. Not for those who follow this case. Not for those who have read the letters and watched the footage and listened to the pastor and tried to reconcile the supernatural with the clinical and the tragic with the criminal. Not for those who think about a little girl named Madyson, because some disappearances are not really about the disappearing. They are about everything that led to that final road. Every pressure, every fear, every voice in the wall, every night spent believing that something evil had found your family and would not let go. They are about what happens when human beings are pushed past the point of ordinary endurance into a darkness that the rest of the world cannot see or enter. And they are about the silence afterward, The long unanswered silence, the kind that settles over a case and never fully lifts. Bobby Jamison. Sherilynn Jamison, Madyson Jamison. They drove into the San Boys Mountains on or around October 8, 2009. They were never seen alive again, and somewhere in the gap between that dirt road and the tree line between the truck with the money and the bones in the brush, the truth of what happened to them still lives. Hidden still, waiting perhaps to be found, or perhaps, and this is the thought that lingers longest, perhaps content to stay exactly where it is. In the dark, in the hills. In the silence between the walls,